And how do you shift and move it out? I think that is changing. That's what's so exciting about Sabah politics is we see it just shift, right? But the majority of people who are in the B40 communities, the more vulnerable communities, still rely on bantuan. They don't think about it as patronage, right? They think about this as cari bantu.
Hello, Internet. This is Koptem Council once again. New week, new episode. And Adi, we are in Sabah. Yay, I'm in Sabah for this time around. And of course, we will never seize the opportunity to bring sensational guests or important guests to our session. So, what do we have today?
Well, today we have none other than Dr. Bridget Welsh, a political analyst from Nottingham University. She has done a lot of groundwork, fieldwork, and a lot of analysis on a very particular topic that's on everybody's lips right now, which is the Sabah state election coming up in the end of November. Can you introduce
Yes,
a few more?
and keeping up to the tradition, because Doctor, we have a tradition in our podcast here where we ask Copilot, the AI Copilot, who is our guest today. So in the end, you will react to me, is it accurate or whatever, outdated to this, whatever AI says. Our guest today is the most prominent voices on Southeast Asian politics, Dr. Bridget Welsh. She's an honorary research associate at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia's Asia Research Institute, a senior research associate at National Taiwan University, and a senior associate fellow at the Habibi Center. Dr. Welsh is a prolific writer, analyst specializing in Malaysian politics, democratization, and electoral behavior across the region. You've likely read her insightful columns in Malaysia Kini, seen her analysis cited in major international news outlets. She's also the author and editor of numerous books, including The End of UMNO and the recent one, Sabah from the Ground. How accurate is that, Doctor?
Most of it except for the first part. I think there are many prominent analysts, including myself, and I consider myself part of a community.
All right.
Okay, the community we hope to have here. Yeah. Have a whole collection here of prominent analysts over here in Koptem Council. So, Doctor, let's just start off, right? I'm going to throw this off the bat because we had this conversation before. We talked about how the elections, right, is that it's not the government we might get, may not be the government that the people vote for, but the government that all the political elites will negotiate amongst each other, right, a coalition. How will this have a bearing, in your opinion, on policy reform or governance in Sabah for the next 4 or 5 years?
So first, I'm going to plug my own podcast, Research Kursi Panas Sabah, which is part of my third season of Kursi Panas, which is why I'm really happy to be here because I think it's part of a podcast community as well, right? But I think well, the first point I made in my episode is that there are two dynamics happening here. One is there's an election for voters, and then there's a selection of who becomes the government. Those are two very different things. And why it's so important in Sabah is because there's so much diversity in the political coalitions and parties. And there's also a history of post-election coalition formation. So this means that, for many voters, they may not get who they voted for in terms of the government. They don't even know really who they're actually voting for in the government because there is this uncertainty afterwards. Now to the second part of your question, which is the involvement of the issues of governance, right? I think there are three things I would dissect from this. The first is, which leader are you choosing? All right. And unless one of the coalitions gets an overwhelming victory, the fact is that it gives power to other players to choose. Part of a compromise, and especially the TYT in terms of making the decision. So the leadership element is still unknown. Number two, the reality is that we're in an era of what political scientists call toxic alliances. Maksudnya, that means that people who, parties work together that used to be enemies come together, right? And they also bring in different patterns of governance. Some may be tainted with corruption, working with those that were supposedly fighting for corruption. And then their voices become less loud, less clear. So the second element is a challenge, right? Is how do you accommodate and bring out a new type of governance agenda, all right? The third thing is that the fact is that the question is what deliverables, right? So whatever you say, despite all the shortcomings, there has been progress in terms of governance in Sabah. In the last 5 years, we've seen some improvements. that I think need to be acknowledged. The reality, however, is that the priority of what those are going to be, the components of what they're going to be, and the real fundamental, meaningful policy challenges that Sabah needs. Right? It's not just about 40% and not just about a money promise. It's about the implementation of that is effective. I think those are things that are particularly a challenge for governance, is to have better implementation, better targeting, and much more strategic plan for the state, this beautiful, beautiful state.
Before we deep dive into Sabah's politics as a whole, what would you use or analogy that you use to describe to the Peninsula's voters or people from the our counterparts in Peninsula, like, because the word of Sabah politics is too complex. It's thrown out a lot by analysts or whatever. How would you summarize it in a very short form that make it clear to the other people in the Peninsula that this is Sabah's politics?
So I think Sabah has an unfair negative image. Right? I think this is not accurate, and I think it is. I think it needs to change. So one of the reasons I'm doing my work and we're having this conversation is to basically help people unpack. So my first lesson is buck up and start learning, because there's a lot of lessons from Sabah that you can learn. Number one, this is the most democratic state in the history of Malaysia. So they have many, many choices that people have between calon, between parties, between coalitions. And that is not just now. Sudah lama ni. It's been a long time. The second thing is that, the complexities are part of Sabah's strengths. So don't dismiss them. Don't put them to the margin. And in fact, it is the complexity of the Bugis like yourself, or the Bajau, or a different ethnic diversity that actually makes Sabah quite unique. So I think Malaysia, so the Peninsula Malaysia, can learn a lot from that diversity of how to accommodate different communities, how to listen to the voices of different perspectives. And then the third thing is that, don't always assume the negative. So the reality is that money politics is very important in Sabah. And everyone assumes from the outside that this is all about vote buying and bribing people. But in fact, it's actually more fundamental. It's about how much it costs to go to the polls. Yeah. All right. It's about the reality of the vulnerabilities that exist in the state from long years of economic vulnerability and discrimination and marginalization of Sabah. So the word complexity should not be an excuse for not learning.
Okay, I just want to follow up from there, because according to DOSM, Sabah is one of the poorest state in Malaysia, and of course, if you couple this complexity plus, to even the cost to travel from Sandakan to KK or Tawau, it's going to be a massive amount for this average Sabahan. So how would you say, this affected the differences between those who are in the peninsula? Maybe they can catch a train, go back to Kelantan, to Perak to cast their vote. But for people in Sabah, they do not have that, and that would add up to the complexity.
Of course, it adds up to the unique circumstances that make Sabah different. Huh? If you want to vote, let's say you live in KL and you want to vote in Kedah. So maybe there'll be traffic jam, but you will boleh balik 6 hours. You can wake up early. You know the roads are going to be okay. You know how much the tolls are going to be, right? You know you can akan sampai. Here, you don't know how long it's going to take, right? And number one. Number two, you don't know, you have to be careful and watch everything on the road, because if you're driving 6 hours, it can be 10, right? In that circumstances, right? So the reality, the level of obstacles that people put up with and the tolerance that people have. I mean, the lack of electricity, the lack of water. I mean, this is, poverty is a product of the fact that there are fundamental challenges here that have to do with a lack of basic needs. And then this is a vicious cycle. We have intergenerational poverty that exists among communities. And until there is a more fundamental recognition of a kind of addressing some of the inequalities, both within Sabah as well as vis-a-vis the federal government, these issues are going to be much more challenging. So the complexities have compounded difficulties And these difficulties, they're resolvable. They are resolvable with a prioritization solution. And this is what's happening. I mean, people don't realize that there's a new generation of leaders of Sabah that are actually seeing and recognizing this. I call them, and I'll have it in a column called Sabah Turks. Right? Yeah. So you have actually generations in their 40s who have a different outlook, and then now people like yourselves in their 20s and 30s. There's a much more excitement, but there's much more demand. Right? This is the thing that is so exciting about Sabah, is that there's the calls for change, demands. A few weeks ago I was in Pitas. Pitas is sick and tired of being associated with the conditions that they face. Rightly so. It's not acceptable. And so you can hear the suara orang Sabah, orang the Pitas is saying, hey, we want some change. Bring us something that we can see.
And adding on to that new wave of mentality, right? There's also this new wave of nationalism, right? The most recent example was Sabah for Sabahans, right? Where do you see this playing out? Because, I mean, this is not the first wave of Sabahan nationalism. James Shin wrote about Kadas of nationalism back in the PBS era, right?
80s, yes.
Yeah. How would you characterize the spirit of nationalism in Sabah now? And how would this have a different bearing compared to back then?
There are two things I'll pull out. First of all, I think that Sabah actually in the 80s was leading the nationalist charge. Now Sarawak is leading the nationalist charge. So everywhere you go, I use the phrase Sarawak envy in a piece that I wrote. But you can see ordinary people. So 3 days ago, I was having a chat with a kampong head, and he was telling me, he says, tengok bagaimana keadaan di Sarawak. Well, look at that, right? And here he is, someone who we would not have expected to be saying this from a poor kampong and others. He says, look what they have, look what we need to have. Right? So the comparison point, and where does this come from? Because now Sabahans have more access to information. The Wi-Fi and the conditions have improved. People see things in a very different way. So the elements and the comparison points have changed, right? And also it's a Sabah nationalism, not just an ethnic community nationalism. So there is a state identity. Everywhere you go in Sabah, there are always Sabah shirts, right? Sabah this, Sabah that. Because there is the sense of pride of being Sabahan, and inclusive of all the communities. So this is unique from what we saw in the 1980s or in the 1990s in the comparison of nationalism, right? And then the second thing that's really challenging is that there are many parties that are using this issue. So Star is one, but Star is also tapping into the traditional Kadazan, Dusun, Murut sentiment, particularly resonating among the Dusun, right? But not only, right? And then there are other parties that are trying to use this about the MA63. So you can see that, after the 40% decision on the court case, so many came out. The GRS government came out. That everyone tried to take a bit of credit, right?
Yep.
Because you can see this. They know this is a sentiment is real, and this is fed into this idea of local party. But then the question is, who are local party, right? Is it that you Orang Sabah, or are you actually do you have a different Sabahan name? Well, so that actually that means substantively different things, right? And so this particular difference is quite interesting, right? Then compared to the past, there is a sense of wanting to differentiate. Right? The only party that is really now being seen as completely federal is PKR.
Yeah. How do you see how people, Sabahan, especially Sabahans, react to the mere label that we have? Like, okay, they label certain parties that based in Peninsula as outsiders parties. So we only vote for Sabahan parties. But we all know the Sabahan parties, after the election, they're always going to, get convenience, marriage of convenience. So how do you see this label is actually taking the center stage rather than the actual merit or what these candidates or politicians can do to their community instead?
So there's really a big difference, right? So I think it's very important in Sabah to leave KK. and go to outside. All right, because the sentiment in the chatter in KK is MA63 and Sabah nationalism. The 40%, and then you can see all these stream of articles. Right, it's almost they talk to each other and they reinforce that. And this is not to say these things aren't real, right? And that the sentiment has gone down about local parties and the concerns about Sabah's place in the overall context. But the main concern of ordinary voters in the kampong and outside of KK is we want somebody who does the work. We want to bring about development. Right? So when I, as a political analyst looking at Sabah politics, this is the place that the calon factor, the candidate factor, is so important to determine what is shaping voting. And this is now even more so when all the parties are working together. They don't know what the parties stand for, right? So so I often, when I talk to fence sitters and others, they check up, saya mau tengok calon dulu. I'm going to watch who it is, right, in that circumstances. And keep in mind that Sabahans have had to, because of the vulnerabilities they faced, the family unit, the social community and networks are very important. Politics is highly personalized. So the impact of that is that they're watching this. And so the Sabah nationalism, if somebody asks somebody in the ground, say in Tulid or in Kwamut, you undi apa? You just cari calon. MA63, they don't see that. They see whether or not they have water, whether or not the road is improved, whether or not their kids have to leave the village to go to get a job and families have to be separated. These are the things they think about.
And speaking on the ground, right? Because of these vulnerabilities that we have in Sabah, economic vulnerabilities for people in the rural area, it becomes easy for patronage to inseminate itself and embed itself in communities, right? Communities have to see politicians as sort of like they're giving largesse, they're giving up money, right? Because, for a lot of these people in the internet, that makes quite a difference, all the 300 ringgit, 400 ringgit during time election. So...
Atau 50 saja.
Yeah, so, but at the same time, we look at YB, but we don't look at their job. That's a title. We don't look at their job, which is Adun, which is a legislative assemblyman. Like maybe people like me, Hafiz, we, in the urban people, we see like we want our YBs to be more legislative assembly people rather than just, orang mati, jumpa orang, atau
Orang kahwin.
pergi orang kahwin, orang whatever, right? So how do we address this disparity of expectations for our politicians, right? Because they seem that they get rewarded more for going down to the ground, servicing the rakyat, giving up money, projects, whatever, compared to actually pushing for policies at the assembly. How do we address this disparity?
Well, it's a vicious cycle, right? Because until you address the root causes of the need for assistance, the reality is that people will rely on that assistance. And the perception is for the long time is that people have been kept poor so that this can be used to keep people in power. All right? And how do you shift and move it out? I think that is changing. That's what's so exciting about Sabah politics is we see it just shift, right? But it's not. But the majority of people who are in the B40 communities, the more vulnerable communities, still rely on bantuan. They don't think about it as patronage, right? They think about this as cari bantu. I need assistance, right? And what do they need it for? To send their kids to school. To basically get access to healthcare, to basically try to find a job. These are basic things. And in a place like Sabah, if you don't get assistance, you don't necessarily find those things, which is very different than Peninsular Malaysia, right? Where these things mean that. And we see the issues of housing, people have had a fire, their lives are destroyed. They don't have that level of security that people would expect and have in other contexts because of the different pattern of governance. The government, in rural areas were transformed in some Peninsular Malaysia, but they have yet to be fully transformed in Sabah. And that is the real big difference in that context. So to address the contradiction, the real challenge is to find a mix. People really do impact. The likability factor is very important. It's connected with it. It's the patronage and likability. But you need to be able to bring in people in the urban areas that do have these other skills, right? That are not so focused on that. There's so many exciting people here who have so many ideas of fixing problems. You are among them, right? Both of you, right? Yeah, about thinking about what those issues are, how to find solutions, thinking about new innovation. So let me tell you an area that I think Sabah has done tremendous innovation is in solar energy. Right, solar energy has really transformed people's lives here. It's the place that I would say even more than Sarawak has had more impact on society. Right, they talk about how it's lit up villages that didn't have villages at night, and it provides some alternative small area of energy when at critical points. And so that's come from innovative, creative ideas that come from Sabah. So I think you need to have candidates. The urban electorate needs to put more emphasis on people who have caliber to be able to bring in new ideas, and also tap into the skills that already exist here in the think tanks and in the ideas. Because it's not that the Sabahans don't have the capacity. In fact, they have more capacity because they've had to survive and strive on their own without assistance. So I think by comparative thing, there is tremendous promise.
Do you think there's an active effort by the politicians themselves to maintain the status quo? Because when you create that dependency, like you mentioned, the people still gonna be depending on you as as savior maybe in Kwamot and certain rural areas. So do you think, and how do we gonna call that out for certain politicians that intentionally do that?
So you have a situation now where a lot of mini warlords, all over Sabah, they're the YB, the saviors, the areas. They're really strong, right? They might have made some changes, right? They've built some new roads. They've built they've provided some houses. We can see that there's changes, and keep in mind that people are coming from a perspective of here when they see one or two things that are up, not necessarily where it should be, but the few things they see progress, right? And they see that they credit the person, they don't credit the government, and they don't credit where the source is coming from, right? This is the challenge, right? So how do you change this, right? Because that person may be one of the people on the 13 videos that show the tremendous corruption. Now, I won't remain names because that's up to the voters. But the fact of the matter is that some people look at outside and say, how can they elect this person again, right? But the fact is that they know how to play the game. And they play that in a particular way, right? In that perspective, and people here, there's much more tolerance. The expectations in the kampong have been so trodden for so many decades that any progress to them is better than nothing, right? So therefore, how does that shift? I think it's already shifting. That's what's exciting, is that it is shifting. There is an expectation, but it may not shift as quickly as other people would like. But this is where people's eyes are open. Right? You hear people say there's no choice, right? And the thing is, everyone ends up playing the money game in some of these areas because that's the reality what gets them voted, right? People don't want to hear about policy because they don't understand it. Political literacy is a particular problem in Malaysia especially, but it's particularly a problem in the kampongs, right? But it's shifting slowly, right? And this is why you now have so many choices, so many dynamics that people will be going to those that buat kerja, who have made the difference. And that is putting pressure on other people to buat kerja, to do better service.
Okay, we've already talked at it broad strokes, right? And you've been active so far, Doctor. What would you say are hot seats in Sabah in this upcoming election? Let's get down to the nitty-gritty of it.
All right.
Okay, well, I've been active doing research on my new book, and studying lots of different areas, and so I've been going to the ground now for many months, which is good, and of course preparing for my podcast in terms of looking at what's happening. And so let me just begin by saying that there are very few safe seats. That means that of the 73 seats, only about 10 or so are really safe for the Chalon. That means there's a high level of competitiveness, even in places where people have been for a long time, because so there are reasons for that. Right? So first reason is that UMNO and PGRS are in a fight. The Malay vote is being highly contested. It's split. So therefore, it's about who can build their machinery, who can portray their calon. So the competitiveness in the Malay Muslim areas is very high compared to the past. So you can see this in places like Tawau, right? So Tawau seats that are interesting, like Tanjung Batu, right? Which is being contested by UMNO Samasuddin, and then I understand Andy also may contest in that seat, right? Who is probably for PGRS, right? This is fascinating, right? And then we also have, because it's the East Coast, we have a Warasan wind, right? So we have that particular dynamic that is taking place in these types of seats. Many of the Tawau seats are highly competitive. Balong, Kukusan, even Sabatik in a different way. All right. And of course, everyone's attention is on Miratai, although I think it's less competitive than it's suggested. So that's not on my hot seat list, but it's people are watching because Ruji has been put there. And there's a lot of visits by the Prime Minister. PKR is contesting there. So that's one area, right? And we can see that in Sandakan, again, on the East Coast, a lot of hot seats. So there are two different types of hot seats. The hot seats are in the Chinese urban areas, but which, by the way, these seats are not as Chinese as people think they are, because there's a lot of ethnic diversity in these contexts with Bajau, with Sungai, with some Suluk voters, and many other different ethnic communities, including Banjar and others. So I would look at Elapura and Tanjung Papat for DAP. Seats next to it, a seat like Sekong, which is quite interesting. Even Karamunting will have some quite interesting different dynamics. Also, the seats like Sungai Manila, Sungai Sabuga, these seats, which traditionally have been long-standing UMNO seats, but now have become PGRS competitive and Warasan, and also have the factor of the TYT, these become very different than before. So the TYT Sun is contesting, I understand, in Sungai Manila, and that opens up a different dynamic. He's contesting for PGRS in a traditionally very strong UMNO base, of which, ironically, was the TYT's UMNO space. So it's become a fascinating type of area. So this is some of the things on the East Coast. You move to the center, a seat like Telupit, which has very dynamic. PBS is holding that seat, but there are new contenders coming in. If we go also coming north, right, Paginatan as well. Even I'm looking at Kundasang because there's new. This is where KDM, which is a party that has built itself in the north, is tend to expand its base. So then the question becomes. The other aspect is that in the KDM areas, there are lots of alternatives. You have the Black Wave, you have KDM party, you have also UPCO, and of course the traditional PBS parties, and then Star. Right. And Star, it's not so clear at this point. I don't know when your podcast is being shown, but the fact is we don't know how many seats Star is going to contest in. But they bring in a particular kind of S4S, the Star for Sabah nationalist sentiment that also has a dynamic among the KDM voters. Right? And KDM voters are very diverse, right? It's actually Bomugun. It's a whole group of native groups of people. So what we see is that this is brought in different dynamics into a lot of other seats. So I will look at seats like Kamparuli. I'm looking at seats such as after Paginatan, going down in the KDM areas, I'm looking at a seat like Bingkor, which is further south, and in a place like Kiringau, Melalap, large numbers, right? And then heading up north, seats like Bangkoka, Pitas, even Tanjung Kapur are also quite hotly contested. So these are some of the seats that I'm looking at, and I'm only giving some long list. I probably should stop talking, but I'm just trying to show you that the level of competitiveness is intense, and the sources of of driving this competitiveness is the multiple choices that people have, and the role that have in many of these different areas. Ironically, it's in the urban areas where they're probably a bit less of the competitiveness, like KK. It's you have to get out to see the places that really have the real hot seats.
Talking about being competitive, how would you say the impact of the love triangle between PH, BN, and GRS in mixed seats like maybe Tanjung Aru or Patagas?
Interesting you use love triangle, Hafiz. I wonder what your thinking is.
I mean, they used to be one, but no.
Well, I think that it's a marriage based on strained relationship now. I think it's a test for the family, whether or not they can survive in that context. Let's step back from the real interesting thing I look at as an analyst is whether or not there's anything called vote transferability, right? So, the first step is, how have they settled the negotiations? Siapa yang, which of the candidates and which of the parties there, and whether or not the ground will accept that. All right, then that's the first step, and that has been going on for months. And I think in the next few weeks it will inevitably have to be settled. And I think those negotiations are not just between PH and UMNO, right, but also PH and GRS. Right, that's also the thing that I think that's still left unknown right now. But then the question is something called vote transferability, as in how many people who voted for one party will really change to the other. All right. So, for example, let's take Tanjung Aru, which you mentioned. Right. Tanjung Aru has an interesting UMNO core. At the same time, it has DAP is most likely to get the seat. All right. So, will that UMNO core vote for DAP or not? Operative word, not, maybe. Right. And then where will their vote go? Right. So the question is how much the family will follow the family, or whether or not the family will go out of the family and vote in a different way. And in the Semenanjung in the Peninsula Malaysia, in the state elections, there was a considerable amount of vote transferability. Right. So UMNO voters, so not all, but they've generally voted for Pakatan Harapan, and Pakatan Harapan really voted for UMNO. So whether or not there will be that particular same dynamic in Sabah, and given that party loyalty is not as strong, I think this is something that people are going to watch. And then the fact is that parties are going to be focused on what happens after the election, and I think that this will test the coalition in a different way, the different dynamics, because they'll be looking to position themselves for government inevitably. And keep in mind, Sabah already has a very different configuration than the Peninsula Malaysia does. So some of the parties like UMNO was in opposition in government. So I think we're going to see the test on whether or not they can fight each other and still be able to cooperate at the national level.
This is a very rudimentary outlook for me, is that we already talked about how this arrangement right now is a marriage of infidelity and a lot of secrets amongst one another, but also one where everyone seems to be cannibalizing each other's seats, especially in the GRS coalition alongside PH. Right? Does this give a lot of leeway for Warisan to make inroads, especially where seats were broken between GRS, BN, and what have you? Would Warisan actually be in a stronger position this time around? Because in the past year, earlier this year, there wasn't much going in terms of Warisan relevance, but now we see that there's a chance for them to, in a way, come back for a lot of people. What do you think, Doctor?
So the inevitability of coalitions working together have two consequences, right? Number one, it limits the ability for them to seek out new seats to expand their base and to appoint new candidates from their party. So parties end up being, reinforcing incumbents or reinforcing elites. This is the inevitability of these type of alliance relationships. So parties get stuck into the seats that they have with the inability to actually contest in other seats, unless they choose friendly contests or they choose to langa, which is to go against the pack, which I think we're probably going to see both in these contexts, inevitably, because there's pressure, right? Parties can't grow and they can't build allow young people to come in. So that's one dimension. All right. The second aspect is that these coalitions will basically they limit your compromise, right? From a perspective of vis-a-vis the other political parties, right? So you end up having to, to build a alliance relationship with other parties, right? And that. So who you are, what you stand for, the narrative you have becomes watered down when you're in these type of deals. So in this context, I think two sets of parties have more comparative advantage. One is Warasan and one is STAR and SAPP working together because they can contest where they choose they want to contest. And number two, they actually can build their own narratives because they're not confined by the alliance relationship or the deals. But at the same time, they also have to spend more money. They have to their resources are stretched over 73 seats, and also the fact is that they end up trying to portray themselves as a nationalist party, all Sabah party, that may in fact not allow them to concentrate on where they might win seats, which puts some of their seats that might be at risk because they lose them because they can't target their resources. But they are allowed to have a clearer narrative vis-a-vis voters. But all of the parties are working in very crowded fields. You're talking about minimum four-corner fights in almost every contest, perhaps maybe the exception of Kwamot, where nobody really wants to spend, or Nabawan, where nobody wants to spend money. So you can see that there'll be some of the areas where there'll be less likely candidates. But some, we're going to see 6, 7, 8 corner seats contests. And of course, this is not new to Sabah. Sabah's had this many times before, but there used to be Bebas candidates and others. But now it's actual party candidates that are coming to contest. So it makes it interesting. I think Party Impian Sabah is also trying to contest otherwise in so many, many seats. I don't think they're going to get very far. But you have reality is that it contributes to the diversity.
To expound on that multiple corner fight, how do you see independent candidates? Because last time out, I think there were at least 3 of them were elected as assemblymen. Do you think that trend is going upwards, or is it gonna be just focus more on party because of the recent issues that everyone to be representing something, and then SLS issue as well coming into the mix. So yeah, if you representing for certain parties means that you are fighting for maybe SLS or whatever 40% issues, but if you're independent, is it enough to swing the vote?
So it depends where, and depends on what type of independent you are. Yeah. So in the urban areas, independents try to use issues and issue-oriented campaigning to try to garner and to also build a base. Those didn't go very well in 2020, right? But the candidates that won in the independents were in the rural areas, or semi-rural seats, usually those that were traditionally warlords of the past who were able to have resources to continue that, right? We can see some of that taking place. This helped to build, for example, KDM as a party using that particular type of modus operandi. The fact is that now many parties are looking for candidates, so therefore there are a little bit less of them, and many of these candidates are finding parties. But the fact is, that candidate-driven issues are still shaping, easily 40%, 50% of the choices at the local levels. So does this mean that there will be potential independent winners? Depends on whether or not some of these long-standing individuals move out, right, and become independents. All right, but remember, one of the reasons independents were put in there was to capitalize on local ethnic sentiments in order to split the votes, in order to give chances to others. So people were funded in that circumstances. So again, you have to analyze who are the independents, where they are, and the seat that they're in to see how they have a chance. The 3 that won were people who were longstanding, rooted in those communities. And it's not yet clear if that's going to happen this time around.
I want to shift the focus on youth voters because there's a lot of conversation going around. They are going to be more than 50% of the electorate. And we saw in 2020, there was about 16% turnout from youth, right? And very, very low turnout, right? So I've heard a lot of mixed opinions saying that youths are gonna vote along the same lines as the parents. I also hear opinions that youth are going to change up everything. They're going to change up the whole election because they're upset with what's going on. They want change, and they've gained inspiration from other countries. What do you think, Doctor? Do you think there's a huge shift when it comes to youth this time around?
So my article coming out on Malaysia Kini is about youth and the youth vote, which I spent considerable time disaggregating, looking at it. So the numbers are not quite as high as I thought originally, like 50%. They're more like a third, all right, of the electorate. But it's still a large number, but because the electorate has increased since 2022, right? So they're quite a large number. They really matter in some seats where they're almost 40% of the electorate in terms of sheer numbers. Now, we know that youth turnout is disproportionately affected by two things. One is that they're far out. They don't live in those constituencies. So even within Sabah, it's too costly to come home, or they're working in the peninsula of Malaysia. So this has an impact. We see in studies that almost 60% don't come back if they're outside, maybe even higher. And the cost factor is a particular issue. The second issue is whether or not youth feel that they can matter. And there is an element, there's just two sides, right? Youth are not one group. There are many, many groups. So we have two different dynamics taking place here in Sabah. One is we have a large number of disengaged young people who feel that they don't think that the system is helping them, or they're not engaged in politics, and that they have political literacy challenges. And on the other side, you have perhaps a most actualized youth than you've ever had in recent years, in recent decades. So these are the people who are participating in the Justice for Zara protests. You saw a student movement that's happening with level of Gen Z protests. If we look at throughout Malaysia, the level of youth activism in Sabah is extremely high compared to other places. And there's an awareness and a connectivity, right? And you can hear it. I was recently having some chats with young people, and it's real big, exciting chatter. You pass by, and all of a sudden they can say they're talking about Warisan, they're talking about other parties, so there's excitement among them. So it's these two different types of areas, and it's the activists and the ones that are going to convince their peers to vote that will make a difference because of the sheer numbers in the election. The question is that we see youth voting patterns actually are quite interesting. They follow that of the other parties, so of the older voters. And this is also because the family is still a very powerful unit in voting and shaping voting. So they ikut saja. If the father is going to go this way, they're going to go this way. Right? And so we're not seeing with families splitting, right? And they ultimately come to a decision, and then the younger person sometimes follows, except in the urban areas, and except with the activists that are trying to push things. And sometimes we have a phenomenon now that's happening where the younger people are telling the older people how to vote, as opposed to the older people turning the other way around. So we can see very different types of dynamics that are taking place. But we have to be careful to realize that it's not the same story everywhere, right? And it's not the impact will be different, right? But at the same time, I'm very struck by how the Zara issue has impacted people emotionally. Now, some people think that it's become less, but in fact, you can see it on people's cars and in the kampung. I'll be driving to Gum, and all of a sudden there's a sheet banner, in a small house way out, quite in the kampung in a cocos area. Oh, so look at that, right? And then you'll see a little car go by, and you'll see other banners. Now, how that translates into voting is not so clear yet. But I think that because many people have tried to appropriate that issue, but the fact is that there's political awareness that they want better education. They want better employment. They want the situation and the conditions in the schools to change. These are issues that are very salient among people, especially young people.
Previous days we had a Priska, she's run the movement Hai Mandak, talking about literacy of democracy within the youths, especially in parts of Kota Belud. So they found out that teenagers in Kota Belud didn't even know the differences between assemblymen and MPs, parliamentarian. So with this combined, the certain fake news that we see from social media, the illiteracy of political literacy, democracy literacy, plus all these emotions that you're talking about, how's that gonna affect the dynamic of young voters? Because on one hand, they have little to or zero knowledge about how maybe the government works, but on the other end, they are very, keeping up with the trend issues of Zara, something that very emotional in nature. So, how would it be fair for us to assume that the youth gonna vote on emotion alone?
I think it's important to say that it's not just emotion, because for many young people, the reason this issue resonates is that they themselves have either experienced it or witnessed it or have to face these conditions in the schools. Right? These are real issues that matter. Safety, child protection, these things impact ordinary people's lives. So I think we should, the emotion comes because it taps into a feeling that they had, right? And they've experienced in that circumstance. But the bigger challenge is how do you deal with misinformation? How do you deal with a social media campaign? And how do you connect that to a limit political literacy, right? In the urban areas, there's tremendous political literacy. People know how to disaggregate one form of information from another information. But that's not the case when people are getting these videos. I mean, and the Zara case is like a very good example to show how much misinformation there has been painted. What happens in the truth is irrelevant. It's what people think is already the narrative that has been couched in a particular way. And this is very unfortunate, most importantly for the family of Zara, right? And for the people who loved her and others in this process, right? But the fact is that it is the social media issue and the campaign around social media is something that is going to change, is impacting youth politics, and it will impact the result. And we saw this in 2022 and throughout Malaysia in the parliament results. But the impact was most in Peninsula Malaysia, not as much here. But this is where even 3 years later, we see much more Wi-Fi access, much more connectivity. People they get this thing, they get their information from Facebook, and then TikTok, and connect in that way. They don't read newspapers. They don't listen to podcasts. Although I hope some people do. But the fact is that they think about it differently, right? So this is where, and the political parties, they're focusing. The narratives are not clear, right? And they talk at voters, not with voters, right? Sometimes, so it's the messaging. There's often a disconnect. So often it's the sensational and often sometimes misinformation that gets access, not necessarily real access. So this is where these types of podcast conversations are very important for young people to disaggregate and to share and to pass on.
Yeah, and I think that's also just a symptom of the current political environment, not just in Malaysia, but across the world as well, right, Doctor? So, I mean, where I'm coming from is that, well, to arm all these young people to disaggregate, right? You say podcast, right? But you yourself are very learned, you're very experienced in political analysis, right? What would you say to prospective analysts, right, on how they can build up these analytical skills? Because back then it was a bit more clear-cut, UMNO. Now we're in a post-UMNO BN political environment, right? There's so many combinations of parties and coalitions now, right? What is a key quality or even advice that you give to potential or prospective analysts or even young people who want to expand their critical thinking? What would be your advice?
So people always tell you, oh, you should talk to your elders, right? And of course, the elders are important and you should listen to what they say. But my advice to young people is always get to know your peers. Listen to the voices of your generation, because you're the ones that are going to shape the future. All right, so engage laterally, horizontally, all right? And then constantly challenge your assumptions. If you think it's this way, then maybe it's another way. So begin to think. So teach yourself how to begin to question what you think you know. All right, and remember yourself. And the third thing is to be open to new ideas, to open your perspective. I mean, sometimes we think we know this is the answer, but in fact, it's actually because of Sabah's diversity and others, there's so much so many layers, right? And you peel the layers off and you see something else, and you see something else, and you see something else, right? So when you're young, you have the ability to see different perspectives because you're more of a blank canvas, so you can paint in many different things. So you begin to see these different areas, talk to different people, and have confidence in being able to your capacity to learn, right? Because ultimately, any good political analyst knows that they're going to be wrong. So the question is, what do you learn from what you made mistake about, right? Or what layer can you add on to be able to see it a bit better? It's like you're in an eye test, and they put the lenses and they add more, right? Can you see this way? Can you see this way? You look okay, but you have glasses. So, but so you have they're constantly it'll be sharper. You'll be able to see things in a slightly different way. I also suggest that you have to read history, all right? Because so much things repeat itself, right? And so many of the Chalon are people who've repeated themselves, right? They were, this is the YB from the past, or this is that, right? So you have to know who they were and what the history is. And the sad thing is that there's not enough political history written about Sabah, which I think hopefully the younger generation can help change that. And there's a lot of young scholars that are changing that.
All right. How about, because you've been going around to most part of Sabah, that's correct?
Yes.
And what would you say to the political parties that competing in the next state election? What should be their top 3 in their manifestos that should they offered to Sabahans?
So everybody says the same thing, right? Roads, water, electricity, right? But nobody gives a way of actually doing it. All right? They all talk about the items they will deliver, but not the path to delivery. I think this is important, right? To be able to think about how to visualize the implementation, right? Money and problems are evident, but the implementation process is not necessarily clear, right? And of course, people are resistant to doing that because they don't know if they're going to be in government, and they don't know. But the fact is that the reality is you're going to need federal-state cooperation, and you're also going to need to improve local institutions on the ground. Local governance needs to improve, and so you have to think about implementation process. Right? Number 2, think about inclusion. All right, of different communities. There's so many communities by ethnicity, but by class, addressing the fundamental economic social divides. We talked earlier about the fact that there's so many levels of marginalization. The fact is that people want a place to be part of the community. They're tired of being displaced. So you want to think about how you're bringing a sense of hope and inclusion to different groups of people. And then the third thing that I think is important to highlight is that a lot of this is economics, driven by economic realities. And all of these problems have become intertwined, right? Where you have, so for example, you have a stateless issue of undocumented persons, which really limits capacity for Sabah to be able to move on from that particular past. It's a highly sensitive area. I fundamentally believe ultimately Sabah is going to need some sort of political compromise in order for this to become something viable, because it pulls the states down. Money is never going to be the solution. It's about dealing with the societal transformation and issues within society in order to transform and help transform the economy. All right. Politicians will make promises. People here are tired of promises not being delivered. They want to see something that is concrete. So keep the promises concrete and to see the bigger picture.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to solve the water issue, electricity issue in 100 days, we like to know the method as well.
Yeah.
Okay, Doctor, maybe the last one before we wrap up. Okay, you're going to be coming here a lot, upcoming elections, right? What would be something you want people to look out for? Like, of course, we're going to see the typical methodology of elections, but is there any, because this is a very different kind of election this time around, what would you suggest me, Hafiz, our listeners, to actually pay attention to this time?
Good question. We've talked about one of them, and to see what's happening among younger voters, because they're going to be a key. But I also think that there are specific communities, ethnic, localized communities that I'm watching. So whether or not there's going to be a Chinese swing, all right, in that perspective among Chinese voters, and what's happening with the divisions within the KDM community. All right, and I'm also looking at how divided the impact of within the context of the Malay electorate. So I'm looking at the divisions within different ethnic communities, which are more complex, to use that word earlier, but also more competitive. Right? I think the third thing is to look at the importance of the candidate factor in shaping voters, and this helps explain the results. Right? You can't just see this as a party. Right? Oh, this is Warasan or that. Right? It's about who the calon is for Warasan in this particular seat. Well, everyone asks me, how do you do your analysis? And I say I do it seat by seat. Right. This is why I move around, right? Because you can't, it's not it now, because of the diversity, you have to recognize that you have to look at things from the ground and then to see the big picture. And so I would suggest is look down, but look around, and move out of KK.
All right, keeping up with the tradition, also in our episodes, we always ask our guests something personal questions, which is, where's your favorite travel destination and what are you reading now? So to that camera.
Well, I'm going to have to say my favorite travel destination is Sabah.
Oh, right.
But actually, even before elections, if I want to take a few days off and want to relax, I will come to
Any
Sabah.
particular spot in Sabah?
I love Kudat. I love the sunrise in Kudat. Well, really, it is just, you sit there and you watch the sun come up.
Sipping coconut at the beach.
It's like you feel the relaxation coming in, right, in this area. But there's so many beautiful places, and places like Tuaran, like Sesarap Bay. There's places that people are unexplored that you can always constantly find. So, I mean, of course, I travel the world, but if I want to take a short trip from KL, Sabah is number one on the list. What am I reading now? I'm reading history, reading tremendous amount of books. But unfortunately, recently, I haven't been reading as much as I would like because I have been on the ground. But I've got a lot of books waiting on the side of my bed after elections.
All right, that's good.
Okay, that was a great episode by Dr. Bridget Welsh. We have a seasoned political analyst who, even not from Sabah, she knows way more than us, and she's the expert. And if you like this kind of content, please let us know so we can have her, or you can go to her podcast, Krusi Panas, which is on its third season, right, Doctor?
Yes.
She's going to go way deep into what is going on with the Sabah elections. So, anything else?
I think that's it for this episode. I guess goodbye for now. See you next episode.